I'd lived in the same brick row house on Ferry Street for 31 years, and for 31 years the narrow carriage alley behind it had been the way I hauled my trash cans, parked my one small car, and reached my back garden. The same way every house on the block had used it since the 1880s. Then one Monday in October, I walked out my back door and found a mason laying a cinderblock wall straight across the mouth of that alley, sealing it off, with a man in a very good coat standing behind him telling me the alley was now private hotel service access, and that I'd have to find another way to my own back door. What he didn't know was that I'd spent 28 years as the county's deed and records examiner, and that the alley he was bricking up was written into the title of his building in ink older than his great-grandfather. Let me tell you about Ferry Street before I tell you about the people who tried to erase pieces of it. Because the street is the whole case, and because you can't love a block the way I love mine without knowing why it's worth 2 years of your life. Ferry Street sits in the old part of the city, 6 blocks up from the river, in a district they now call Old Ferry Historic. 11 row houses on my side, built in a single terrace in 1883 by a shipbuilder who wanted housing for his foreman. They're narrow, 3 stories, red brick with stone lintels and iron stoop rails, and they share party walls, which means my house and my neighbor's house are quite literally holding each other up. One common brick wall between us, the way they've held each other up for 140 years. Behind all 11 runs a carriage alley, a recorded shared service easement, 6 feet wide, that was platted with the terrace in 1883 so that coal, ice, and later automobiles could reach the rear of every house without going through the front parlor. Every deed on the block, including mine, carries the same easement language. It is not a courtesy. It is a property right, recorded, appurtenant, running with each and every lot. I bought my house in 1994, when this district was half abandoned, and you could buy a shipbuilder's row house for the price of a decent car. My late husband, Tomas, and I spent 15 years restoring it. We pulled 6 layers of paint off the stair rail. We found the original heart pine floors under the linoleum. We repointed the front facade one weekend at a time. Tomas passed in 2016. I've stayed. The house holds him the way the party wall holds the house next door. Quietly, structurally, without making a show of it. I should tell you what I did for a living because everyone on the other side of this story assumed I was just a widow with a lot of old books, and that assumption cost them enormously. For 28 years, I worked in the county recorder's office as a deed and records examiner. My whole professional life was the chain of title, reading old deeds, tracing easements, catching the errors, knowing which recorded instrument controls when 2 of them disagree. I can read a 19th century handwritten conveyance the way you read a text message. I know what appurtenant means, and I know what it takes to extinguish it, which is a great deal more than a man in a good coat thinks. When the county wanted to know whether a 1901 easement was still valid, they asked me. I retired 4 years before any of this started. I did not retire the knowledge. There's a neighborhood association, too, the Old Ferry Terrace Association, all 11 houses. And for most of my time here, it did almost nothing. Collected a small annual fee for the shared alley's upkeep and the gas lamp at the corner, held 1 potluck a year, and otherwise left everyone alone. 11 houses, 1 lamp, 1 potluck. That's the scale of what was normal, and I want you to hold on to that scale, because when it broke not over a hedge or a paint color, but over the alley, and behind the alley, over the far larger question of whether Ferry Street would stay a street where people live or become a product that people rent. I'll give you one more piece of the block before the trouble because it explains why the neighbors trusted me later. About 12 years ago, the city sent a notice that it intended to rationalize the addresses on our terrace and, in the process, quietly reclassified our shared alley in its records as an unimproved public way. A bureaucratic error that, left alone, could have let the city pave it, close it, or hand it to anyone. Every other reaction on the block was a shrug. I wasn't shrugging. I walked into the recorder's office where I'd worked for 28 years, pulled the 1883 easement grant, and showed the clerk, a young man I'd trained, that the alley was a private recorded easement, not a public way, and got the classification corrected in a single afternoon with a single instrument. After that, the neighbors on Ferry Street decided I was the person you called when the paperwork came for you. I never asked for the job. But when you've read the fine print for a living, people remember, and one day, they need you. Tomas used to say I kept the house the way I kept a title chain. Every layer accounted for, nothing painted over that shouldn't be. He wasn't wrong. I don't like fights. I like clean records. And a false record, a wall where an easement should be, a lien where a home should be, is a thing that itches until it's set right. Hold on to that, because everything I did over the next 2 years, I did to set a record straight. The through-line question, the one that kept me up more nights than I'll admit, was never really, will I beat this developer? It was older and simpler. Will the terrace still be homes when I'm gone? Or will I be the neighbor who let it become a hotel with the lights on and nobody living inside? Everything I did over the next 2 years, I did to answer that. The house at the end of the terrace, number 11, the corner unit, the biggest one, sold that summer to a man named Preston Vane. Vane was not a neighbor and never pretended to be. He was a high-end flipper who bought trophy historic properties, gutted them behind their protected facades, and sold them to people who wanted the word historic without any of the inconvenience of history. He'd made real money doing it. And he had a plan for number 11 that required, as these plans always do, something that wasn't his to take. His plan was a boutique hotel. Not on paper yet. On paper it was still a single-family renovation. But I knew, because you learn to read a permit the way you read a face. He filed for interior demolition, then for a rooftop amenity terrace. Then his contractors started referring to the bedrooms by number the way you number hotel rooms, not the way you talk about a home. And the corner unit, number 11, sat right at the mouth of the carriage alley, which meant that to make his hotel work, to give it a grand private service entrance, and keep the great unwashed of the terrace from trundling their trash cans past his future valet stand, Preston Vane decided the alley should simply stop being everyone's. So one Monday in October, without a word to any of us, he sent a mason to brick it up. I came out my back door with my coffee and found a man troweling mortar onto cinderblock across the mouth of the alley, and behind him, supervising, Preston Vane in a coat that cost more than my first car. I want to give you the conversation close to word for word because it is the whole man. I asked him what he thought he was doing to our alley. Our alley, Vane said, smiling, like the word was adorable. It's platted on my parcel at this end, and it's going to be private service access for number 11. I'm not closing anything you have a right to. You've all just been using my frontage for parking out of habit. Historic charm. He gestured at my trash cans. There's street parking on Ferry. You'll adjust. I told him the alley was a recorded easement, appurtenant to every deed on the terrace, including his since 1883, and that no amount of brick could close a recorded easement. Recorded, he repeated, the way they always repeat the word that's about to cost them. Look, I have a title report. I have a survey. You have a feeling about your grandmother's alley. If you want to fight a 140-year-old scrap of paper against a funded renovation, be my guest. My masons finish Thursday. He turned back to the wall. It's an alley, not the Alamo. It's an alley, not the Alamo. Remember that line, because it's the one that cost him. Preston Vane genuinely believed that because the alley's pavement sat on his end of the block, he could wall it off, that a deed to the underlying dirt beats a recorded easement across it. He is far from the only person who believes that. It is wrong in a very specific and expensive way, and I was uniquely equipped to show him exactly how. Because reading which recorded instrument controls was literally my job for 28 years. I want to be fair to Vane because he wasn't a cartoon, and the fairness matters to the story. Before the wall, back when he first bought number 11, he'd actually come to my door. Charming, expensive cologne, a bottle of natural wine held out like a peace treaty. He told me he loved the bones of the block and wanted to honor its history. He asked me, over that wine, what the terrace had been like in the old days, and I told him about the shipbuilder and the coal wagons and the party walls, and he nodded along like a man taking notes. It was only later I understood he had been taking notes, that everything I told him about the block's history he was filing away as either an obstacle to remove or a marketing asset to sell. The alley I described with affection became, in his mind, underused frontage. The party walls I called the bones of the block became, on his spreadsheet, shared structural liability, the seed of the assessment scheme that came later. He wasn't listening to love the place. He was listening to price it. That's the thing I've learned about the men who do this. They study what you cherish, not to cherish it, but to find the seam where it can be pried loose. Now, the three questions, because Arc 1 has to answer them fresh. Why didn't I just call the police or sue him that day? Because a bricked-up alley is a civil matter, not a crime. The police would shrug and tell us to work it out with a lawyer, and a lawsuit filed that week would run $15,000 or $20,000 and take a year and a half, during which Vane's wall would stand and I'd be hauling trash around the whole block. There was a faster, cheaper, and far more permanent path, and I knew every step of it. Why did Vane think he'd get away with it? Because his title report, a real one from a real company, showed the alley pavement on his parcel, and he stopped reading there. A title report on a single parcel doesn't always foreground an easement that burdens that parcel for the benefit of 10 others. You have to read the terrace's original 1883 plat and the easement grant, and Vane had never read a 19th century plat in his life. He had half the picture and mistook it for all of it. Why wouldn't he back off when told? Because backing off meant his hotel lost its grand private entrance and had to share a service alley with 11 households hauling recycling, which, to a man selling exclusivity, was worse than losing money. Pride, and a business model that depended on the alley being his. So I stopped arguing that morning. I said, "Finish your wall. You'll take it down yourself." He laughed. Then I went inside and did the thing that actually wins. The first thing I did was go get the paper, the real paper, and I knew exactly where it was because I'd spent my career in that building. I pulled the original 1883 subdivision plat for the terrace, the recorded easement grant that created the carriage alley for the common use of the several lots and their successors forever, and the easement language carried forward in the chain of title of all 11 houses, including, this is the part that ended it, Preston Vane's own deed to number 11, which recited that he took title subject to the recorded alley easement. He had signed, at closing, a deed that told him in plain language the alley was shared. He'd just never read to the second page. It cost me about $11 in copy fees to assemble the whole thing. $11. But I didn't stop at the easement because I'd noticed something else on my walk around the block. The second violation. The one that turned Vane's problem from a private dispute into a public one he couldn't control. That rooftop amenity terrace he was building? We're in a historic overlay district. In Old Ferry Historic, you cannot alter the exterior of a building. Not a window, not a cornice, and absolutely not add a visible rooftop deck without a certificate of appropriateness from the district's Architectural Review Board. It's the whole reason the block still looks like 1883. I walked the alley with binoculars one evening and confirmed what I suspected. Vane's rooftop deck, with its steel stair and glass railing, was going up with no certificate of appropriateness posted, in flagrant violation of the historic overlay. He'd bet that nobody on a sleepy terrace would report it. He bet wrong, because the sleepy terrace had me on it. So I made 2 moves, in writing, on the same afternoon. First, my attorney, I did hire one for this, a plain and careful woman named Ruth who did real estate work, sent Vane a formal notice of the recorded easement, with the 1883 grant and his own deeds subject to language attached, demanding he cease obstruction and remove the wall. Not a lawsuit, a notice, with the paper attached, so that everything he did from that moment on, he did knowing. Second, and this is the move that gave the whole thing teeth, I filed a complaint with the city's Historic Preservation Office reporting unpermitted exterior alteration in the overlay district, a rooftop deck and steel stair with no certificate of appropriateness. That is not a neighbor dispute. That is a code violation the city itself enforces, and a historic district takes it seriously, because unpermitted alterations are the thing that kills a district one deck at a time. Here's the micro setback, and it was a bad 10 days. Vane's response to Ruth's notice was to finish the wall, cap it, even paint it, and to have his own lawyer fire back a letter arguing that the easement had been abandoned because, he claimed, the alley hadn't been used for its original carriage purpose in a century and had degenerated into informal parking, which, he argued, terminated it. Abandonment is a real doctrine, and for about a week and a half I genuinely worried, because if he could convince someone the easement had been abandoned, the wall could stand. I sat at my kitchen table at midnight, the way I used to over a hard title, and I worked it through. And the answer, when I found it, was clean. An easement is not abandoned merely because its use evolves. Hauling trash cans and parking a car through a service alley is the same kind of use, rear service access, that coal wagons made in 1883. The purpose never changed, only the vehicle did. And more to the point, abandonment requires proof of intent to abandon by the easement holders, and 11 households using that alley every single week is the precise opposite of intent to abandon. I had photographs. I had the neighbors. I had my own 31 years of trash cans. You do not abandon the only rear access to your own house. While I waited for the Preservation Office to act, I did the small, patient work that wins these things. I built the record. Every morning I photographed the wall and the rooftop deck, date-stamped from my own back windows. No trespass, just the daily proof that the unpermitted work was proceeding. I pulled Vane's permit history from the city's online portal and printed the pages showing an interior renovation permit and nothing authorizing a rooftop structure or an alley wall. I wrote down the contractor's license number off the truck. None of it was dramatic. All of it was the kind of quiet documentation that, when a city inspector finally arrives, turns a he said, she said into a closed case in 10 minutes, because everything the inspector needs is already sitting in a folder. That's the part people skip. They call in a complaint and then wait, empty-handed. And when the inspector comes, they have a feeling and a raised voice. I had a folder. Folders win. The Historic Preservation Office moved first, and it moved hard because unpermitted work in the overlay is exactly the thing they exist to stop. An inspector came out, a meticulous woman named Ms. Reyes, who'd been protecting the district for years and had the particular weariness of someone who watches people try this every month. And she didn't take my word or Vane's. She checked the permit record herself, walked the alley, photographed the rooftop, and confirmed what my folder already showed. The rooftop deck and steel stair had no certificate of appropriateness, and the cinderblock wall across the historic carriage alley was itself an unpermitted alteration in the protected district. She issued a stop work order on the exterior alterations and, critically, cited the alley wall as a violation too, because you can't wall off a historic carriage alley in an overlay district without review any more than you can bolt a satellite dish to a landmark. Vane now had a red tag on his rooftop and a red tag on his wall. His finish Thursday had become remove it all. The easement claim resolved shortly after, and it resolved the only way it could once the 1883 grant and his own subject to deed were on the table. Faced with Ruth's documentation and his own lawyer's honest assessment that the abandonment argument would lose, Vane took the wall down. He paid to build it, and he paid to demolish it, and the alley was open again, 6 feet wide, the way it had been since Chester Arthur was president. The rooftop deck had to be removed and rebuilt, smaller and screened, to something the review board would actually approve, which took months and killed the amenity terrace his hotel brochure had promised. There was a small moment during the wall fight that told me who my neighbors really were, and it mattered later more than I understood at the time. The morning the masons started demolishing Vane's wall, old Mr. Okafor from number 7 came out in his robe with a thermos of coffee, set up a folding chair in the alley, and watched the whole thing come down brick by brick like it was a parade. He didn't gloat. He just wanted to see it. When the last cinder block came out and the alley was 6 feet wide again, he poured me a cup from his thermos and said, "My father hauled coal down this alley when he first came to this country. He'd have liked knowing it's still here." That was the moment I understood this wasn't going to be a story about me. It was going to be a story about 11 households who each had a reason the block was worth something no developer's spreadsheet could hold. I'd spend the next 2 years reminding them of that, and they'd spend it reminding me. The number, because you've earned it. Between the survey and title report, the mason work to build the wall, the demolition to remove it, the abandoned rooftop deck, the redesign, the fines from the preservation office, and his legal fees, Preston Vane spent a little over $63,000 to end up with an open alley, a smaller deck, and a hotel concept with no grand private entrance. He never once raised his voice at me after that. He'd nod, the way you nod at someone you've decided to stop thinking about. I nodded back. I thought that was the end of it. One flipper, one wall, one lesson in the difference between a deed and an easement. I was wrong. Because when I pulled the ownership record on number 11 to close out my own file, just tidiness, an old habit from the office, I found that Preston Vane didn't actually own it. A company did. And that company already owned 3 other houses on Ferry Street. The alley was never the plan. The alley was a test. I found the shape of it the way I found everything, by reading records nobody thought a retired clerk would bother to pull. Number 11 was owned by an entity called Ferry Hospitality Group LLC. Preston Vane was listed as a managing member, which is a polite way of saying he ran the renovation but didn't own the building. That alone wasn't sinister. Investors use LLCs all the time. What made me sit down at my own kitchen table was the rest of it. I pulled every recent transaction on Ferry Street and Ferry Hospitality Group, sometimes under its own name, sometimes through smaller LLCs that shared one registered agent, a detail you only catch if you read the fine print, which I have done professionally for 30 years. Owned 4 of the 11 rowhouses on the terrace. Number 11. Numbers 9 and 10, 2 doors down, and number 2 at the other end by the corner. Somebody was assembling the block, buying rowhouses one at a time, running them or planning to run them as short-term rentals to cover the carrying cost, and positioning to do something much bigger with the assembled terrace. You don't need a conspiracy for that. You need money, patience, and a belief that the old owners in between will be easy to move. And the mechanism to move the old owners, The thing that connected Preston Vane's alley wall to the far larger plan was the one entity I hadn't thought about in decades, because it had never mattered. The Neighborhood Association. Because a month after the alley wall came down, the old Ferry Terrace Association, 11 houses, 1 lamp, 1 potluck, got a new president. A woman named Simone Ackerley, who had bought into number 9 8 months earlier, volunteered for the board with a generosity nobody questioned, and, I would soon confirm, was the operations director for Ferry Hospitality Group. The company that owned 4 houses now controlled the association that governed all 11. And it had a plan for what to do with that control. The first letter came on heavy cream cardstock, which is how you always know an association has gotten expensive. It was from the old Ferry Terrace Association, under new professional management, and it announced 2 things. The first was a party wall structural preservation assessment. According to the letter, a structural engineering review had determined that the terrace's shared party walls, the 140-year-old common brick walls holding all 11 houses together, required urgent stabilization, and each owner was being assessed $18,000, payable within 90 days, with a lien to be recorded against any house that didn't pay. $18,000 on a terrace where the annual fee had been $60? The second, buried on page 3 in the flat language these documents use precisely because they hope you won't reach page 3, was a note that the association's board had voted to support a use variance application to permit transient lodging use within the terrace, and encouraged all owners to consider the benefits of professional hospitality management of their units. Let me translate, because it took me one careful read to be sure I wasn't being paranoid, and I'm rarely paranoid about a document. The party wall assessment was a squeeze. Ferry Hospitality Group owned 4 houses. It could easily pay its own assessment by moving money from one pocket to another. But the 5 or 6 holdout owners, the old residents, the widows, and the retired teachers, and the couple who'd raised 3 kids on the block, could not casually produce $18,000 in 90 days. The plan was elegant and ugly. Manufacture an assessment the holdouts couldn't pay, record liens against their houses when they didn't, and then, over a year or 2, pick the liened houses up cheap when the owners gave up. And the use variance was the prize. Legalize transient lodging so the assembled terrace could become a boutique hotel, unit by unit, without ever filing a single honest hotel application. Simone Ackerley, president of the association, was the operations director of the company that would collect. Now, the 3 questions, fresh in Arc 2's context. Why not just sue the association? Because you can't easily sue over an assessment until it's levied and a lien recorded, and if you wait until then, you're the one with a lien on your house fighting the association's lawyer who is being paid out of your own dues. Suing is slow and expensive and, crucially, it doesn't remove the people doing it. I didn't want to win a lawsuit against the board. I wanted a different board, and I wanted the assessment dead before it became a lien on Mrs. Delaposa's house at number 4. Why did Ackerley think she'd get away with it? Because she'd read the same thing every operator reads about small associations. Nobody comes to the meetings, nobody reads to page 3, and a determined person with a friendly quorum can pass almost anything while the other owners sleep. She wasn't wrong about most associations. She was wrong about this one, because this one had a retired records examiner on it who reads page 3 for pleasure. Why wouldn't they back off? Because they'd already spent real money, 4 houses, carrying costs, the whole assembly, and the assessment and variance play was the linchpin that turned all of it into a hotel. Backing off meant eating it. Sunk cost, same as Vane's wall, with more zeros. I didn't go to the next association meeting angry. I went prepared, which is worse. The first thing I did was send the association, certified mail, a statutory records inspection demand. Our state, like most, gives an association member the right to inspect the association's records, the governing documents, the minutes, the financials, the management contract, and, above all, the actual documentation behind any assessment. I cited the statute by number and named a date, and I asked for one thing in particular: the structural engineering review that supposedly justified an $18,000 per house party wall assessment. They stalled, of course. They offered me records upon payment of a $400 administrative fee. I resent my demand, citing the specific statutory right to inspect in person at no charge, named the date again, and showed up with a legal pad and a camera because the same statute lets you photograph records during inspection. And here is what I found, or rather what I did not find. There was no structural engineering review. There was a one-page letter of opinion from an engineer who, it turned out, did consulting work for Ferry Hospitality Group, stating in vague terms that aging party wall systems may warrant evaluation. No inspection, no findings, no specification of what work the $18,000 would buy. It was a number in search of a justification, and the justification didn't exist. People tell you everything about a case by what they can't produce. That was the whole game, and once I had it, I stopped playing defense. I did 3 things over the next 2 months. First, I got a real structural engineer, one with no connection to anyone, whom I paid $4,000 of my own money to actually inspect the party walls. His report was 2 sentences of good news and 1 of vindication. The terrace's party walls were in sound condition for their age, showed normal settlement and no urgent structural deficiency, and required routine maintenance, not $18,000 per house stabilization. I now had a real engineering report contradicting a fake one. That fake one, sent to extract money under false pretenses, was no longer just an overreach. It was, potentially, fraud. I want to tell you about Mrs. Della Posa at number 4, because she's the reason ARC 2 wasn't just a legal exercise. She was 81, widowed, on a fixed income, and she'd raised 3 children in that row house. When the cardstock letter came demanding $18,000 in 90 days, she didn't fight it, and she didn't call me. She just stopped opening her mail, and she started sleeping badly. And she told her daughter she supposed she'd have to sell the only home she'd ever known. That's what the assessment was designed to do, not to collect $18,000, but to frighten a specific kind of neighbor into leaving. When I finally sat at her kitchen table and explained that the assessment was built on a fake engineering letter and that no lien was going to touch her house, she cried, and then she got angry. And an angry 81-year-old widow who has decided she is not leaving is a more formidable thing than any developer expects. She came to every meeting after that. She signed the recall petition first. The people who run these schemes count on the Mrs. Della Posas of the world being too tired and too frightened to fight. It is the single biggest miscalculation they make. Second, I wrote a 1-page memo to all 11 owners. Plain language, no lawyer words, laying the 2 engineering reports side by side and explaining exactly what the assessment and lien plan would do to anyone who couldn't pay in 90 days. I attached the public ownership record showing Ferry Hospitality Group owned 4 houses and that the association's own president was the company's operations director. I didn't editorialize. I put the records next to each other and let people draw the line. On a block of old neighbors who had watched Preston Vane's wall go up and come down, they drew it fast. Mrs. Della Posa at number 4 cried at her own kitchen table, partly from fear and partly from relief that someone had read the letter she'd been too frightened to open. Third, I invoked the recall provision in the association's own bylaws, which the management company had helpfully handed me during my records inspection. and gathered the signatures to call a special meeting to remove Simone Ackerley and her 2 board allies. On an 11-house association, the threshold was low, and the owners by then were extremely motivated. The micro setback in Arc 2 came from the variance, not the recall. Because while I was organizing the recall, Ferry Hospitality Group's use variance application went to the city's Board of Zoning Adjustment, and for a few weeks it looked like it might sail through. The company had a smooth land use attorney arguing that transient lodging would activate the historic district and support preservation through economic use, and the board seemed tempted by the tax revenue. For a bad stretch, I thought we might win the association fight and still lose the block to a variance that turned all 11 houses into legal hotel rooms. So I fought the variance the way you actually beat one, which is not with outrage, but with the law of variances itself. A use variance is supposed to be granted only when a property has a unique hardship that prevents any reasonable permitted use, not simply because the owner would make more money doing something else. What Ferry Hospitality Group wanted was to change the use of an entire residential terrace to commercial lodging because it was more profitable. That's not a hardship variance. That's spot zoning. Rezoning one owner's assembled parcels to a use the surrounding neighborhood doesn't have. And spot zoning is exactly what the variance process is forbidden to do. I appeared at the Board of Zoning Adjustment and said 3 things, plainly, the way 28 years across a public counter taught me to say hard things simply. That the applicant had shown no hardship, only a preference for higher profit. That granting transient lodging use to 4 assembled houses in a residential terrace was textbook spot zoning, and that the applicant's own agent currently chaired the neighborhood association pushing residents out via a fabricated assessment, which I documented. Then I sat down. I'll tell you the exchange that actually turned the variance hearing, because it's the kind of moment these fights come down to. Ferry Hospitality's land use attorney was smooth. He argued that transient lodging was consistent with the district's commercial heritage, that the shipbuilder's terrace had always housed working people coming and going, and that a hotel was really just the modern expression of that tradition. It was a good line, and I watched 2 board members start to nod. So when my turn came, I didn't raise my voice. I asked the board one question and then answered it. Council says this terrace always housed people coming and going. That's true. It housed them. They lived here. They got their mail here. They registered to vote here. Their children went to the school down the street. A hotel guest does none of those things. The difference between a resident and a guest isn't a technicality. It's the entire difference between a neighborhood and a business. You're not being asked to honor a tradition. You're being asked to end one. Then I sat down. The nodding stopped. The Board of Zoning Adjustment denied the variance, not because I gave a great speech. I gave a plain one. But because once no hardship, just more money, and spot zoning were on the record, and once the board could no longer pretend a hotel was just houses with a nicer lobby, a board that grants it is a board that gets reversed on appeal, and boards know it. The recall meeting happened the following Thursday in the parish hall of the church on the corner because 11 angry households don't fit in anyone's front parlor. Simone Ackerley came, and she was polished. She talked about preservation through investment and professional stewardship and protecting property values. She was good, right up until Mr. Okafor from number 7 asked her, straight out, whether she was the operations director of Ferry Hospitality Group and whether that company owned 4 houses on the block. She paused, and in that pause every neighbor in the room understood the answer was yes, and that she'd hoped no one would ever ask. Then I read the 2 engineering reports aloud, the fake one and the real one, side by side. The vote to recall Ackerley and her 2 allies was 9-2. The 2 were Ackerley and her own second seat. The party wall assessment died on the table, never levied, no lien ever recorded against Mrs. Delaposa's house or anyone's. The new board's first act was to terminate the arrangement with Ferry Hospitality Group's management and to adopt, unanimously, a resolution opposing any transient lodging use on the terrace. The number for Arc 2 is harder to pin down than the alley. A killed assessment and a denied variance don't come with a tidy invoice. But between the collapsed variance, the fabricated assessment they never collected, the legal fees, and 18 months of positioning that evaporated, Ferry Hospitality Group's squeeze cost the enterprise well into 6 figures of wasted effort, and cost them the thing they actually needed, which was control of the block and a legal path to lodging. I let myself believe for a few months that we'd won. 2 rounds, 2 villains beaten, the alley open and the assessment dead. Then Simone Ackerley, on her way out of the parish hall that night, stopped beside me at the door and said one quiet thing, almost admiringly. "You know the terrace was never really the point," she said. "You do know that." Before she reached the door, I said one thing back, because I'd learned something over those 2 rounds that I wanted her to carry out with her. "Simone," I said, "you keep telling me none of it was the point. But you had it backwards the whole time. You thought the block was the obstacle and the hotel was the point. For us, it's the other way around. The block is the point. It was always the point." She didn't answer, but I saw it land, the way a true thing lands on a person who has spent years believing a false one. And she was gone, and I realized she was right about one thing at least, that I still didn't understand the whole picture. The alley was a test. The association was a shortcut. Neither was the reason. The reason was a demolition permit and a mid-rise and a fight over whether Ferry Street was allowed to be old at all. A fight I hadn't yet learned was coming. I only saw the whole board because a former colleague from the planning department called me back about something else entirely. I'd gone down to the city planning office to make sure the terrace's alley easement was properly flagged in the records so no future owner could ever try Vane's wall again. While I was there, I asked an old friend named Idris, who'd examined plats alongside me for years before he moved to planning, whether anything was pending on the old ferry block. Just habit. Just the question you ask when you've spent your life reading permit queues. He pulled it up and went quiet, then turned the monitor toward me. There was a pre-application filing on the block. The applicant was Ferry Hospitality Group's parent, a development company called Rendam Urban Partners. And it wasn't a hotel at all anymore. Rendam had filed for a development feasibility review to demolish numbers 1 through 4 of the terrace, the corner and the 3 houses beside it, including 2 they owned and 2 they were still trying to get, and replace them with a 7-story mixed-use tower, ground floor retail, boutique hotel above, condos on top. The renderings showed my terrace's preserved facade neighbors dwarfed by a glass box where a third of the 1883 shipbuilder's terrace used to stand. Here's the thing about demolishing a row house in a historic overlay. You can't just knock it down because you own it. Demolition in the overlay requires approval, and the overlay's whole purpose is to prevent exactly this. But there are 2 ways developers get around a historic overlay, and Rendam was going for both. First, demolition by neglect/economic hardship, the argument that the historic protection imposes an unconstitutional hardship because the owner can't earn a reasonable return keeping the old buildings, which, if a commission buys it, forces them to allow demolition. Second, and more dangerous, getting the block's protection weakened, arguing that this end of the terrace had lost enough integrity, partly thanks to Vane's gutting of number 11, which I now understood in a new and sickening light, that it no longer merited full protection and could be released for redevelopment. That was the real plan, and everything before it had served it. The alley wall tested whether the old owners would defend their rights. The assessment squeeze tried to empty the holdout houses cheaply. Vane's interior gutting of number 11 quietly degraded the district's integrity to support a future argument that the block wasn't worth saving. Every move had been softening the ground for a demolition permit. The through-line question finally had a clean, hard shape. Would the terrace be allowed to stay old, to stay homes? Or would a third of a 140-year-old block be released for a tower? Everything came down to Arc 3. I'm going to slow down for this arc because it's the one that settled it for good, and because the tool that saved the block is the one ordinary people know least about. A tool that reaches forward through time and protects a place from every future pressure at once. The first thing I did was stop thinking about any single house and start thinking about the whole terrace as one thing worth protecting permanently. Because here's what I understood from 28 years in records. Winning a demolition fight this time just means the developer refiles next year and the year after until an owner or a commission gets tired. The only way to end it is to change the legal status of the block so that demolition isn't a fight you win. It's a thing that cannot happen. And in a historic district, there is such a tool. It's called individual landmark designation. An overlay district protects a neighborhood in general and can be argued around. But an individual local landmark designation, where a specific building or terrace is formally designated a protected landmark by the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission, is the strongest protection in the toolkit. Once a structure is individually landmarked, it cannot be demolished or substantially altered, essentially ever, absent extraordinary findings. It runs with the land forever. Every future owner takes it subject to the designation. It is, in the most literal legal sense, a way of protecting the terrace from every developer who will ever come, including ones far smarter and better funded than Rendam. There was one more piece of Rendam's plan I had to understand before I could kill it, and it's the piece that told me just how coldly the whole thing had been engineered. Their 7-story tower didn't only need the corner parcels and the alley. It needed air rights, the development rights to build up into the space above the block. In our city, the zoning let a developer transfer unused development rights from one lot to another under certain conditions, and Rendam's plan quietly assumed it could pool the unused air above the low 3-story row houses and stack it over the tower site. That's how you turn a block of houses into a tower on paper. You treat the sky above people's homes as inventory. When I saw that in their feasibility filing, something hardened in me, because it meant they weren't just after 4 buildings. They were after the airspace over all of us, the light, the sky, the low 19th century roofline that is the entire character of the block. And the beauty of an individual landmark designation is that it freezes that too. You cannot transfer development rights off a landmarked terrace to build a tower next door, because the designation protects the resource as it is, roofline and sky and all. Landmarking didn't just save 4 houses. It took the sky above 11 of them off the market permanently. So I petitioned to have the entire 1883 Shipbuilders Terrace, all 11 houses as a single historic resource, individually designated a local landmark. I want to be honest about the work because the shows never show it. I spent 4 months as an amateur historian, which, it turns out, is just being a records examiner pointed at the past. I documented the terrace's history, the shipbuilder who commissioned it, the 1883 construction, the architectural significance of an intact worker housing terrace of that period, the original plat, the carriage alley, the surviving ironwork and lintels. I got a preservation architect to write a statement of significance. I gathered the neighbors' deeds and photographs. I built the nomination the way I used to build a title chain. Every claim documented, nothing asserted I couldn't prove. Mrs. Della Posa, who'd been too frightened to open a letter a year earlier, spent her evenings helping me scan old photographs of the block. Mr. Okafor found the shipbuilder's original ledgers in a local archive. The block that Rendam had tried to pick apart, house by house, became a single thing with a single voice. The micro setback in Arc 3 was real, and it was frightening. Rendam, seeing the landmark petition coming, moved fast to file its economic hardship claim first, arguing that historic designation would deny the owners of numbers 1 through 4 any reasonable economic return and therefore couldn't be imposed. For a few weeks, their lawyers made it sound plausible. Hardship is a genuine constitutional limit on historic regulation, and if they proved it, they could demolish despite any designation. I lay awake over that one. But hardship has a specific legal meaning, and it is a high bar. The owner must show the property cannot earn a reasonable return in any permitted use, not merely that redevelopment would earn more. And Rendam's own numbers sank them. These were sound, restorable row houses in a desirable district, the kind of houses the rest of us lived in comfortably every day. The claim that they couldn't earn a reasonable return as homes was absurd on its face, and I proved it was absurd by putting the simplest possible evidence on the record. The terrace's other 7 houses, occupied, maintained, and manifestly earning their keep as exactly what they were. You cannot claim a row house can't be a viable home while standing in a terrace full of viable homes. I need to tell you what those months of building the landmark nomination actually felt like, because it wasn't dramatic. It was a card table in my front room, covered in photocopies every evening for a season. Idris, my old planning department friend, couldn't take sides officially, but he could tell me, over coffee, what a winning nomination needed to contain, and that was worth more than any lawyer. Mrs. Della Posa turned out to have a shoebox of photographs going back to the 1950s, the terrace in snow, the terrace with a grocer's cart, her own wedding on the stoop of number 4 in 1961. Mr. Okafor found the shipbuilder's ledgers in the Maritime Archive downtown, the actual 1883 construction accounts in a bound volume nobody had opened in decades. A retired professor 2 blocks over wrote us a statement of architectural significance for free because she'd wanted this terrace protected for 30 years and nobody had ever tried. What Rendam had spent 2 years trying to break into 11 separate frightened owners, I spent 4 months turning back into a single block with a single, documented, unshakable story. That's the quiet secret of these fights. A developer's greatest weapon is that the neighbors don't know each other. Introduce them and give them a table to sit around, and the whole strategy falls apart. While the landmark petition and the hardship fight moved forward, I played the last card, the quiet one. Rendam's tower needed the corner, and it needed the assembled parcels to function at 7 stories, and the carriage alley easement I'd defended against Preston Vane ran right through the footprint of their proposed tower. That 6-foot recorded easement, appurtenant to all 11 houses forever, meant Rendam could not build over or close the alley without the consent of every one of the 11 owners. And after 2 years, there was no universe in which they were getting 11 consents. The easement didn't win the case by itself, but it meant that even if everything else failed, the tower could not be built at the density their pro forma required, because a recorded 1883 easement ran straight through the lobby. I made sure the Landmarks Commission and the planning staff both understood that the site was permanently encumbered. There was a stretch during the landmark fight that nearly broke my nerve, and I'll tell it honestly because the honesty is the useful part. Rendam's lawyers were clever, and they'd found the one soft spot in my armor. Number 11. Preston Vane's gutted trophy house. When Vane had renovated it, he'd stripped much of the historic interior, and Rendam's attorneys argued that number 11 had lost its integrity, and therefore the corner of the terrace no longer merited protection, which, if the commission agreed, would carve a hole in the block big enough to fit a tower. For 2 weeks I couldn't sleep, because they were using Vane's damage I hadn't been able to stop, as the very wedge to justify demolition. It felt like the block was going to be punished for the wound the first villain had left in it. Then a preservation architect I'd brought in showed me the way through. Individual landmark designation of a terrace rests on the significance of the whole ensemble and its exteriors. The intact 1883 street wall, the ironwork, the rhythm of the 11 houses, not on whether one owner had modernized one parlor. An intact historic terrace doesn't lose its landmark worthiness because a flipper redid a kitchen. The exteriors were pristine. The ensemble was whole. Their wedge was real, but it was thin, and once I understood exactly how thin, I stopped losing sleep and started writing the rebuttal. The Landmarks Preservation Commission held its hearing on a winter evening, and this is where a lifetime of reading rooms and records earned its keep. Rendham brought lawyers, renderings, and a consultant who talked about highest and best use and the cost of nostalgia. I brought 3 things. First, I brought the nomination. 4 months of documented history establishing that the terrace was a significant, intact 1883 resource plainly worthy of individual landmark status. Second, I brought the demolition of the hardship claim. 7 occupied, thriving homes in the same terrace, proving beyond argument that these houses could earn a reasonable return as what they'd always been. Third, I brought the neighbors. Not a mob, which loses these hearings, but a record. 11 households, old owners and the few good newer ones, each submitting short, specific, factual statements. Mr. Okafor spoke. Mrs. Della Posa, 81 years old, stood at the microphone and said 9 words I'll remember until I die. I have lived on this block for 50 years. The room was quiet after that. The Landmarks Preservation Commission voted to designate the entire terrace an individual local landmark, and it denied the economic hardship claim on the record. Not because I gave a great speech, I gave a plain one, but because by the time I was done, designation was the only defensible outcome, and demolition was impossible on the facts. You cannot grant a hardship demolition for a building that's identical to 7 thriving homes next door, and you cannot fail to landmark an intact 1883 terrace once its significance is fully in the record. I should tell you what happened to Preston Vane, because his ending isn't tidy, and the untidy part is the truest. Once Rendham's tower died and the block was landmarked, number 11, Vane's gutted trophy, the boutique hotel that never was, became an expensive liability he couldn't flip, because its whole value had depended on the block becoming something it now legally never could. Ferry Hospitality Group sold it out from under him. Before he left, Vane stopped by my stoop one evening, no wine this time, and stood at the bottom of the steps. People learned eventually where the line was. "You knew from the first week, didn't you?" he said. "When I brought the wine, you already knew what I was." I told him the truth. I hadn't known at first, but I'd known the wall was illegal and everything else had unspooled from there. He nodded slowly. "For what it's worth," he said, "you saved this block from me. I don't think I'd have known how to stop myself." Then he asked if he could take one last photograph of the terrace at dusk, the street wall, the gas lamp, the 11 brick faces in a row. I said sure. It's a beautiful block and it's a free country. He took his picture and left, and I never saw him again. That photo of a terrace that would outlive his ambition is probably still on a hard drive somewhere, the best preserved block in the district that was never his to sell. Rendham Urban Partners withdrew its demolition feasibility filing 4 months later. There was no dramatic collapse, no perp walk. There was just a development company that had spent, by the time you count 4 row houses bought at trophy district prices, carrying costs, a management operation, legal fees on a variance, a hardship claim, and a landmark fight, Plus Preston Vane's $63,000 alley misadventure, several $1 million assembling the pieces of a tower that could never be built because a 140-year-old terrace and a 6-foot alley had never been theirs to erase. They put their 4 row houses back on the market the following year and, as far as I know, took a considerable loss. 2 of them sold to families, actual families with actual children who used the alley to haul their trash cans, the way people have since 1883. Before I get to the end, let me answer the question I know some of you are still holding, because it's fair. Wasn't there an easier way? Couldn't I have hired a big law firm at the start and handed them the whole thing? No. And the reason is the most important thing I know, so I'll say it plainly, the way I'd explain a hard title to a young clerk. A big firm up front would have cost more than the entire 2 years cost me, and it would have started one giant all-or-nothing lawsuit against a well-funded developer, the exact fight Rendham wanted, because they win those by attrition. They have more lawyers, more time, and more money to lose than any of us. What a developer cannot beat is the cheap, patient, correct move made in the right forum at the right moment. $11 in copies that killed an alley wall. A certified mail records demand that exposed a fabricated assessment. A $4,000 honest engineering report against a fraudulent one-page letter. A spot zoning objection that sank a variance for free. And a landmark designation that made the whole block permanently undemolishable. A designation that didn't cost me a lawsuit, just 4 months of doing what I'd done for a living anyway. Every one small. Every one legal. Every one aimed at the exact soft spot where their plan actually lived. I never fought them where they were strong. I fought them where they were weak. One recorded instrument at a time. And here's the part I most want a young person on an old block to hear. Nobody is coming to save your street. Not the city, not the preservation office, not some reporter. Those systems are neutral. A landmarks commission will release a block for demolition as readily as it'll protect it, depending entirely on who walks in with the documented nomination. For 30 years, nobody on Ferry Street had to be that person. Then the money came, and somebody did. It happened to be me, because I'd spent my life learning to read the paper. But the tools aren't secret, and they aren't mine. A recorded easement, a records demand, a spot zoning objection, a landmark nomination belong to anyone willing to read to page 3 and stand up at the hearing. I think often about why it had to be me and whether that's fair, because it isn't, really. Not everyone on Ferry Street could have read a 19th century easement grant or built a landmark nomination or stood at a zoning board and said the word spot zoning like it meant something. Mrs. Della Posa couldn't have. Mr. Okafor couldn't have, not alone. The system that protects an old block assumes somebody in the neighborhood happens to have spent 28 years learning to read it. And most blocks don't have that person, which is exactly why most blocks lose. That's the quiet injustice underneath this whole story. The tools are public and free and available to anyone, and almost nobody knows they exist until the letters start coming and it's too late to learn. If I've done anything worth doing here, it's not that I saved my own house. It's that 11 households now know these words: easement, certificate of appropriateness, spot zoning, landmark designation, and they'll never again be the frightened, silent block that a man in a good coat counts on finding. People ask me whether I did it all for the money. I didn't get any money. I spent it. $4,000 on the engineer, legal fees for the alley, $11 here and $30 there on records, 4 months of evenings I'll never get back. Nobody wrote me a check. But the through-line question got answered. Will the terrace still be homes when I'm gone? Yes, it will. It's a landmark now, All 11 houses protected forever, and the alley is open, and children, I don't know yet, will haul their trash cans through it 100 years from now, past the party walls holding each other up the way they have since 1883. Simone Ackerley told me the terrace was never the point. She was right. The point was whether a place stays what it is, homes, a street, a neighborhood, or gets assembled into a product somebody rents. That's not decided by who has the most money. It's decided by who's willing to go find the right piece of paper and stand up at the right meeting and say calmly, no. I sit on my stoop most evenings now, on Ferry Street, and the terrace runs off to the corner exactly as the shipbuilder drew it in 1883. 11 brick houses leaning gently on one another. There's no tower. There's no cinder block across the alley. There's a landmark plaque by the corner and a gas lamp and the sound of somebody's kids in a back garden. Tomas would have liked the plaque. He'd have liked the kids more. Preston Vane told me it was an alley, not the Alamo. He was wrong twice, because it turned out the alley was the line I'd hold, and the retired clerk hauling her trash cans had spent 28 years learning exactly which 140-year-old scrap of paper stops a tower cold. If it were your block, would you have spent 2 years and your own savings to get it landmarked forever, or taken the buyout when the letters started coming? Tell me in the comments what you'd have done on Ferry Street. And if you want to see how a retired fire captain stopped a resort from turning a whole mountain road into a death trap, that story's next. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes and HOA/property regulations. Names, characters, and specific locations are fictional or have been changed for privacy. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. This content is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal advice.